we are going to get started here with our keynote session with Caleb Watney. Let me just introduce Caleb real quick. He's the co-founder of Institute for Progress, which aims to accelerate technological, scientific, and industrial progress. And they're based here in DC. On top of that, Caleb holds a master's in economics from George Mason University and has spent the last 8 years working in policy in DC. Some cause areas that Caleb is tackling include biosecurity, AI policy, immigration, and meta-science. To give you a sense of what Caleb is about, what makes him tick, his Twitter bio is, "The US is the R&D lab for the world, and we should act like it." Caleb is also a committed Christian. He and his wife, Kat, attend Res Church over in Capitol Hill. And Maddie and I have had just like a wonderful pleasure of getting to know them better over the last couple of years. So I'm going to pass it off to him in a moment, but during all the talks, we're going to have Slido, which is a live question software where you can submit your questions for the speaker. We're going to do about 10 to 20 minutes of Q&A for each speaker at the end. And put in questions during the talk. You can also upvote questions that you like. We don't have the link in for this talk yet in Swapcard, but we'll have it up in about 5 minutes. So check that for Slido, and thank you very much, Caleb. Woo.
Hey everyone, really excited to be here. Thanks to JD for the invitation. As you mentioned, I run the Institute for Progress. We are a nonpartisan think tank here in DC working on a broad range of tech, science, and innovation policy issues. And I get the chance to talk a lot about why innovation, why science matters, why the US in particular should have a focus on it. But I get fewer opportunities to kind of talk about the way that my faith informs that work and kind of why I'm motivated to work on these issues and what role the church has to play in kind of science, tech, and innovation. And so I was really thankful for the opportunity to come and speak with you all. And the topic of the conversation is raising the ambition of the church. I think in some sense this is the audience that least needs to hear this message compared to the rest of the church. But nonetheless, we're going to hear it anyways, and I think there's a lot more that we can do. And I hope that it can be in some sense inspiring or help encourage you to keep up the good work that all of you are doing. So I want to start off with maybe what I see as a case study of a really cool opportunity when the church did change the world. So some of you might remember back in 2005, there was this really exciting coalition of church leaders that together pledged over $3 billion over the course of the next several decades to make really tangible investments in malaria eradication. One thing that was especially interesting was the focus that they put on investing in new vaccines, therapeutics, different kinds of diagnostic mechanisms that a lot of development experts were also skeptical of at the time. And despite sort of a sense that these expectations and the timeline were unrealistic, in the decades since, we've seen malaria fall by about half. And here you can see in this chart from Our World in Data, especially child deaths from malaria have fallen precipitously. And now many acknowledge that the end is in sight. It seems like we're actually finally on the cusp of several vaccines through new mRNA technology that could finally kind of put a nail in malaria. And what a tremendous testament it is to the church that they played such an important role here. Obviously, this did not actually happen, unfortunately. You may be wondering, like, was this a Mandela effect? Did you misremember what happened in 2005? Unfortunately, this coalition of Christian leaders did not actually exist. There was not the ambitious investment that the church was making. Instead, the progress itself against malaria was entirely real. That chart about malaria eradication, that is completely real. But it was not the church that I think played a major role in it, or certainly was not the face of this progress. Instead, that was the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the President's Malaria Initiative, and the World Health Organization. I think the question we should be asking ourselves is, why wasn't that the church? Why was that headline not real? What was stopping the church? What does it say about the church that we, in some sense, didn't have the ambition, the world-changing, the world-conquering ethos to say, you know, we're going to set our sights ambitiously on eradicating malaria by 2030. Instead, we left that to the rest of the world. So I borrowed this hypothetical from this article I read a few years ago titled, "The Catholic Church Used to Be Silicon Valley, Can It Be Again?" And I think the author sort of describes the difference here, not to a lack of money, but in some sense, a different kind of mindset that he sees as being unique to Silicon Valley, but used to be the domain of the church. And so the author is Catholic and is talking specifically about the Catholic Church, but I think the critique is much broader. I just wanted to read this segment. So he argues the reason the Gates Foundation was in some sense the pioneering face of this initiative was that not because they had a great deal of money, plenty of foundations have billion-dollar endowments and comparatively little impact, but because it combines money with the mindset of a technological entrepreneur. It combines faith in a vision so ambitious as to border on the delusional with a healthy disregard for conventional thinking, and particularly a relentless focus on trying new things, measuring their impact carefully, tweaking them, and then scaling them up once they work. This mindset, more than any specific technology or even concentrations of capital, is why Silicon Valley is a unique phenomenon. As innovation scholars have pointed out, there are plenty of places outside of the Bay Area that have world-class scientists or access to capital, but what is unique is the entrepreneurial culture of Silicon Valley. To say that the Catholic Church as an institution lacks that sort of culture seems like the understatement of the century. We are the dinosaurs that Silicon Valley nerds laugh about. But as the author kind of points out, and as I want to highlight, this did not used to be the case, in the sense that we today look at Silicon Valley as both being the driver of technological innovation. Silicon Valley today is also the driver of a lot of social and philosophical innovation. The fact that effective altruism, in some sense, has its roots in the Bay Area is indicative of the fact that that area as a community has been the place where world-changing innovation and new ideas come from. The church used to be that role, but we in some sense lost our ambition. I think it's underrated the extent to which the church has historically been a driver of scientific, social, and technological change. Throughout its history, this kind of world-changing Silicon Valley-type ethos has in fact resided within the Christian church. Just a couple examples. Monasteries were a hotbed of agricultural improvements. There's a lot of scholars that point out that this sort of the Malthusian trap about sort of this self-perpetuating loop of having more humans come into being, not being able to feed them, and that leading to mass famines, was partially broken by some of the agricultural improvements that came out of Christian churches and monasteries. Francis Bacon was himself a friar, and he formalized the scientific method itself. Copernicus, another committed Christian, invented or helped formalize the heliocentric model of the solar system. The historian Rodney Stark points out that Christians in the Roman world had longer life expectancy than their non-Christian peers, and he primarily points this out to the creation and the formalization of the first welfare state that was sort of officially organized by the Christian church. Gothic cathedrals were the most ambitious and exciting architectural and technological wonders of their time, and in the creation of these really ambitious projects, they ended up having to create a whole new set of architectural and engineering breakthroughs that we still use today. Many institutions that we now think of as just being so commonplace, the modern university, the hospital, the welfare state, have their roots in Christian institutions and in Christian thought and in Christian respect for the individual and the inherent dignity of each person. And I want to point out that this should be the natural response. We should in some sense not see this as a historical aberration, but the natural role of the church, the sort of overwhelming responsibility that we have placed on us to be the hands and feet of Jesus. How could it be anything else if we were to take the gospel seriously? The church today does not quite have this same world-conquering ethos. The church today primarily takes a reactive rather than a proactive approach to both social, technological, and scientific change. We let the world change outside of us, and then we sort of decide how do we want to respond. Insofar as the church talks about technology, it's oftentimes within the context of family controls around cell phones. And don't get me wrong, that is a good and healthy and appropriate thing to do. We should have ways for families to think carefully about the use of social media and whatnot, but that cannot be the extent of the church's ambition when it comes to technology. We have in some sense seated our hand on the rudder of progress. Where are the world-shaking plans to change the world? Where is the world-conquering ethos that the Christian church used to have that I think we are in some sense called to have through the gospel? What happened effectively? I think part of this was actually a theological change. This is, I think, especially prevalent within American evangelicalism, but more generally has been kind of a meme within Christianity. I think some scholars have traced it to post-Black Death. But the sort of focus on individualism, the question, how do I get to heaven, as being the primary driver of what the church talks about, how it organizes itself, what it thinks is its mission in the world, as being a sort of very narrow focus on how do I get to heaven, how do we help other people get to heaven. The theologian N.T. Wright, especially in his book, Surprised by Hope, Rethinking Heaven, the Resurrection, and the Mission of the Church, points out that if you take the gospel seriously, this is a rather incidental part of Jesus' mission. He does not spend a lot of time talking about the fact that you narrowly will get to be saved from death. That is, of course, part of the gift of eternal life, but that is not the focus of Jesus' mission. It's not what Paul talks about. The core message of the gospel that you hear again and again and again and again is that Jesus is king, and we are supposed to build his kingdom on earth. That is actually the message of the gospel. I think if you take this seriously, if you imagine instead that we all float away to the clouds when we die, that everything we build here turns to dust, it sort of makes sense in some sense what the Christian church is doing. There's no reason to really engage in deep, serious institutional building if you think nothing we do here really matters. But if instead you put your focus rather than on an ethereal heaven in the clouds and instead on the new earth, the new Jerusalem, that is actually a much bigger focus of the Bible, you will realize that the institutions we are building here can be the hands and the feet of Jesus. The things we can build here really deeply matter. They will in fact echo and resonate throughout eternity. And if you take that seriously, I think it should raise our sights and our ambition. In John 14:12, Jesus says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, whoever believes in me will also do the works that I do, and greater works than these will he do, because I am going to the Father." Jesus is very explicit and straightforward that the ministry and the mission that he takes on earth is only the beginning, and that through his Holy Spirit, the church will be empowered to do even greater things. Take a moment to say, why should the church be ambitious? Why does this matter? What are the stakes here? I think there's a couple of points. One, we have a God-given duty to steward the earth, but we are called instead towards the new Jerusalem rather than back to Eden. We can't just retreat. We can't just say this is how things used to be. We want to head back to there. We should be orienting ourselves towards the mission of the church as being a sort of a forward sense of momentum, of progress towards the new Jerusalem. But societal progress is neither inevitable in the sense that it will happen regardless of our actions, nor is it one-dimensional. I think sometimes people imagine there's just one big lever and we either go up or down, faster or slower. I don't know if anyone has ever played the Civilization games, but I like instead the analogy of a technology tree. We have a lot of agency in actually deciding which branches of the tree we go down, which technologies, which breakthroughs, which social institutions do we invest in. These are not just sort of purely exogenous forces that happen outside of our reach, but we as a society, as the church, can have a deep influence on the order and the direction and the speed at which we get these innovations or these breakthroughs, or the sense that they are sort of internalized. I think we're also called to understand God's creation. If you look historically, a lot of famous scientists were themselves driven to study science because they wanted to understand the natural and good world that God created. What is physics if not understanding the set of systems that God has sort of imbued into the very DNA of the universe? And so that sense of scientific curiosity is, I think, a very healthy and useful way of looking at the world and understanding his creation. And that we are crucially called to be co-creators with God. Humanity in particular, relative to the rest of God's creation, has a sense of innovation and creativity that we are supposed to express as part of being God's image on this earth. The historian Rodney Stark points out that pagans converted to Christianity en masse because it offered meaningful, tangible change to their quality of life and their circumstances. I think sometimes there can be a sense that, well, if people are converting because life in the church is better, isn't that kind of like cheating? I think he points out that this is exactly wrong. That this is actually the church's job, is to change people's life. If we are being beat for the battle of world healing, we should not be the least bit surprised when we are beaten in the battle for souls. So in fact, like the church's testament, the church's witness to the world is also driven by the kinds of change that the church is driving. That people look at the lack of change from the church, and I think that is no small part of the sort of the dysfunction in the church today. Ross Douthat, in his book, The Decadent Society, also makes a really interesting point that if you look historically, religious and scientific revival seem to be connected historically. The last great revival, Billy Graham kind of going from stadium to stadium, happened at the same time that we were landing a man on the moon. And I don't think that's an accident. He sort of argues that maybe the causality might even be flipped. There might be religious revivals that lead to sort of a period of intense cultural fervor and, again, a deep desire to understand the world and to really push out its boundaries. But certainly sometimes Christianity can think of itself in opposition to science, and I think Ross does a good job in that book of kind of pointing out the fact that, in fact, these cultural forces and intensities can really be connected and tied. Now, of course, on the other hand, I don't think we should be utopian about what we can achieve. We will never achieve the full culmination of the kingdom of God on earth until Jesus comes back in all of his glory. But at the same time, we can make a lot of progress today. I like the set of 3 graphs and statistics from Our World in Data. They point out that the world today is awful. Globally, 4.3% of all children die before they are 15 years old. It's really bad. And we should, I think, deeply internalize how bad it is and how broken the world is. At the same time, the world is so much better than it used to be. In the past, around 50% of children died. Today, it's only 4.4%. In some sense, that is a massive amount of progress that's been made in a short amount of time. At the same time, the world can still be so much better. 4.4% of all children worldwide today die, but if we were to get to the levels of the European Union, that would be less than 0.5%. All of this can happen in the now, but not yet. That is, in some sense, the role of the church to be the bridge between the broken world we have today, but the full culmination of the kingdom that we know is coming, and to be the work of actually making that happen. I also like this verse from Jeremiah 29:7. But seek the welfare of the city where I sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. I think, again, there's this deep theme that cuts throughout the Bible, that Christians are not supposed to just care about their own welfare, but instead the welfare of the world. We're supposed to deeply engage with the world and to seek the welfare of the city that we've been placed in. Connecting this a little bit to the work that I do at the Institute for Progress, I think a lot about path dependency in science and technology. Again, kind of cutting against this idea that science and tech is inevitable, the set of things that we develop are always going to happen that way, and that we as humans have little agency in the order or the direction or the kinds of business models that these actually get internalized in. One reason that we focus on the issues that we do, there's a couple of reasons. One, we think there's a very useful role for the public sector to play in actually shaping the direction of scientific and technological innovation. And at the same time, we think that there's a useful role for the US and for other liberal democracies relative to China. There are a lot of small value judgments that get built into technologies and business models by default, by the people that are actually building and developing the systems. Whether this is the degree of surveillance or privacy protections, whether it's about how interpretable or interoperable these systems are, what are the kinds of worker protections that are actually enabled for the people actively building these will all be decided in some sense by the victors. They say history is written by the victors. Well, technology business models are built by the creators. And so in some sense, you only get to shape the technology if you yourself are on the frontier and actively building it. And so a lot of our work at IFP is oriented around making sure that future technologies are being built in a way that is compatible with, and if anything, complements liberal democratic values. And we think that that's why it's so important for the US to kind of keep its role as the global R&D lab, is because we think those values are more likely to be built if the right kinds of institutions are actually involved in their creation. But I think the exact same lesson applies to the church. The church has values that it wants to make sure are compatible with the future, and which could be very likely to be ignored if not for the church's involvement. There's a long church tradition of things like caring for the preferential option for the poor and recognizing the inherent dignity of human beings. If we want to make sure that future business models, future technologies, future inventions are compatible with and embedded in the world in a way that continues to promote and protect those values, we actually have to be an active co-creator with the world, an active developer. Otherwise, we don't get a say. Again, being purely reactive means that we are letting the world decide kind of the terms on which these systems are embedded. So what could an ambitious church do? And here I have one of my favorite covers from one of my favorite books, A Candle for Leibowitz, which I would just commend to all of you. It's really great, I think, an interesting philosophical treatment of sort of the cyclical nature of technology and progress to some extent, but also the unique role that the church can play in that affair. And it's also just an excellent book. So we missed out in some sense on our chance to eradicate malaria as the church. But this is not the end of history. There are still lots of other problems that we could set ourselves to. My friend Jacob Trefethen, who works on a lot of science policy at Open Philanthropy, wrote this really fascinating blog post called 10 Technologies That Won't Exist in 5 Years. And his point again is that technology is not inevitable. Oftentimes there are a lot of social problems or new inventions that will not happen by default, either because they don't make the company a lot of money or because it won't get you a lot of recognition on the news, but nonetheless are dramatically important social problems that we should be setting ourselves to, and that we have a lot of agency in sort of deciding which of these things happen. And so this is just a great list of 10 very specific sort of technological targets or social missions that we could ourselves set ourselves at, and just sort of how big their impact is in the world. And if you just Google that title or Jacob Trefethen's blog, you can find it there. So in addition to, say, ambitious vaccine targets for eradicating diseases, what are some other technological targets or things that the church should be setting itself at if we really took our mission seriously and if we try to be ambitious about the role of the church in the world? I might present a hypothetical progress agenda for the church. Just to highlight a couple of examples, you might say abundant clean energy is really important. Again, if humans are taking our role seriously as being better stewards of the environment and of the world, whether that's geothermal or advanced fusion or nuclear or clean energy through solar and wind, there's, I think, a number of technologies. A lot of Christians already work in these fields, but I would love to see the church specifically playing a sort of a concrete role in both the testing and deployment. My wife and I live up in Brooklands, and I was really excited to see that nearby Catholic University just installed the largest solar array in all of DC, and we're like a couple of blocks away from it. So I thought that was kind of a nice example of what one version of this might look like. I think also another version of this is taking seriously what are ways in which we can begin to undo some of the harm that humans have done onto nature. And my friends Santi Ruiz and Micah Mettercraft have been really on, so I feel obligated to talk about we could rewild bison on the American plains. There's some fun plans that the Department of the Interior is working on. This might be another way of actually utilizing our newfound power through technology, through our mastery of the earth, to begin to repair creation in certain ways. We could aggressively target lead elimination, which is just a massive problem, especially throughout the developing world, but also here in the United States. And I think this is not something that's going to happen by default, something the Christian church could uniquely set itself on, recognizing the inherent value of sort of what does it look like for healthy neurological development around the world, and we know the pernicious effects that lead can have on that. We might be able to target alternative proteins to help reduce factory farming. We could aggressively scale social interventions for the poor. And in particular here, I want to return back to what is the way that the church typically approaches social interventions versus what is the way that Silicon Valley typically approaches social interventions. And what would it look like to deeply embed that ethos of self-improvement, radical evaluation, and actually effectively scaling the things that work. We could try to come up with new technological breakthroughs to make childbearing and rearing easier for this sort of culmination of healthy families. We could prevent future pandemics, which we just saw from COVID was incredibly devastating, and we are not making, even today, the kinds of investments that can help prevent future pandemics. We could advocate for YIMBY or Yes in God backyard bills, which would enable sort of dense, affordable housing right around church communities, which would enable us both to kind of better take care of our neighbors and to sort of engage in more ambitious sort of local ministries on the city level. We could help fund and develop a better scientific understanding of chronic pain and addiction that have actually, I think, not gotten the attention from, say, the National Institutes of Health that they should, but are nonetheless devastating for lots of people both in the United States and around the world. We could target specific patent buyouts for key pharmaceutical drugs that we know the poor are especially reliant on, and instead buy those out and enable them to be made very cheaply as generics, kind of to continue to ease the diffusion of those key pharmaceuticals around the world. We could also develop a better theologically grounded understanding of what it means to be human in the age of AI. I think there's going to be a lot of hard questions about what does it actually mean as we see sort of these mechanical processes beginning to echo or simulate things that we can do. And I think there's going to be a lot of open questions about what that actually means. Of course, there are challenges, and I think there's one key important challenge for the church that is actually trying to be ambitious, and that is the fact that we are divided. If you look at this graph, this is R&D spending by different countries all around the world, and there's a reason that R&D spending tends to be dominated both by national governments and by multinational corporations. It is a very financially intensive industry. It's hard to imagine your local parish investing significant resources to make a dent in vaccine development. But I think this is actually a very important element of why the church's witness is being hurt by its division. It prevents us from actually taking sort of very concrete, ambitious plans to be able to improve the world when we can only plan on our local parish level. I think there's sort of a sense in some American evangelical circles I run that we should celebrate the Reformation, and certainly I think the changes of the Reformation were important, but we should be striving actively for church unity and church unification, both for the theological witness of the church, but also for our practical organizational and operational effectiveness. We cannot meaningfully affect the church when we remain as divided as we are. So also just practically cause prioritization is difficult. It's going to be hard to align on sort of an agenda of what are the most important things to actually prioritize unless you have some sort of formal structure for thinking through and making decisions about what to prioritize. So I think, in some sense, one of the first big ambitious projects that we should strive for as a church is unity. We shouldn't just take it as a default that we're going to remain in our separate denominations for the next 200 years. That is, I think, in some sense, the default path. But again, we have action, we have agency. We can take steps today to make that more likely. In the meantime, I still think there's a lot of really productive things we can do. First, I would love to see the creation of a cross-denominational institution that focuses on R&D investments. What would it look like to have every local parish or every local kind of congregation begin to donate some percentage of the tithes that they get towards some large R&D fund that can act as sort of a combination issuer of scientific grants and also a social impact VC investor to really target specific technologies or specific breakthroughs that, again, we think might be neglected by the world, but would be tremendously impactful for kind of the witness of the church and the good that we want to see. I think Christians should also seek vocations in the technology sector. Again, you don't get to decide the direction of technology unless you are yourself on the frontier building it. And I think a lot of Christians, I don't think quite recognize the passivity of the church in the technology developments that are happening today. So we should actively seek to develop the skills and abilities and institutions that would enable us to have an impact on the frontier. And finally, I think the church can experiment. I want the church to recapture that kind of ethos of world-conquering, world-changing ambition, in the sense that we can very carefully and aggressively try out new ideas, measure them, and scale them when they work. The Christian church used to do that, and I think we could do it again. So be different, try new things. What would it look like for your local parish to try out some new theory of social change in your world, maybe scale a new kind of way of helping the homeless? See, if you wanted to actually get a proper power calculation to see how many different denominations or how many different parishes would you need to tie together to have a statistically significant sample that allow you to actually do a randomized control trial. I think that'd be great. This is absolutely within the purview of what the church could and should be doing, but I fail to see that kind of ambition today. But I think we could do better. I want to end with two quotes. One from Corinthians. Therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, stand firm. Let nothing move you. Always give yourself fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labor in the Lord is not in vain. Again, to echo this message, the things we build on this earth, the institutions and the good we can do, are not just going to pass away like ships in the night. Instead, they can echo and they can resound throughout all of eternity. And second, I love this quote from the end of the Decadent Society from Rostow, so down on your knees and start working on that warp drive. Thanks.
Thank you, Caleb. So we are going to do Q&A. So if you could open up your swap card app and just see the questions there and upvote the ones you like, that would be helpful. In the meantime, I'd like to fire off the first question. So is part of the reason the church was at the cutting edge partly because it had a monopoly on structured institutions, which is no longer the case?
Yeah, I definitely think the structure of monasteries was actually important for the kinds of innovations that they were coming to. Monasteries had to be very sort of self-sufficient, and that sort of gave them a specific reason to invest in different kinds of agricultural innovations. They also found themselves with lots of time on their hand, which maybe led them to be a bit more industrious and creative about the things they were doing. But again, I don't know that those were so particular to monasteries at that particular point in time that we couldn't find ways to recreate it today. So I don't know, I think the fact that the church had a monopoly on certain kinds of institutions is actually like a lagging rather than a leading indicator. If Christians were today on the cutting edge of science and technology, again, we could be a natural home for all the smartest, most cutting edge scientists. We should in some sense desire to build institutions of science and culture and industry that are so powerful, so obviously the most innovating, cutting edge, that secular scientists want to come work there. They know that that's where the most promising and ambitious ideas are.
Progress agenda for the church scale brings to mind the social gospel movement of the early 20th century. So how is a progress agenda different, and why won't it fail like the social gospel movement seems to have?
It's a good question. I don't know as much about the history of the social gospel movement and kind of the particular problems there. I think in general there's kind of been an aversion in the last, say, 100 years of the church to deeply engage with science and technology and sort of consider that part of the purview. I think there's been sort of an overemphasis on just behavioral remedies and sort of social supports, which again are very important and can be complemented by tech and science. But if you look at the things that have actually changed the world in the last 200 years, they have been primarily scientific and technological changes. And so if we are in some sense leaving that domain on the side, then you're leaving the most powerful tool, the most powerful way in which society actually changes over time.
The Catholic Church is probably the biggest denomination, quote unquote, and are fairly unified. Why haven't they done some of these high-level ideas already?
It's a great question. I don't know. I mean, I would be interested to talk to Catholics in the room to sort of get a sense. My sense is just these are not even questions that are sort of actively talked about within the Catholic Church, but I agree that I put some part of this blame on the entire Christian community and certainly the lack of sort of unity on certain parts of American evangelicalism. But the fact that Catholicism is so unified and is not doing this means in some sense I put more blame on them for having not tried.
Most churches, in my experience, this is the commenter writing this, aren't very interested in ideas outside of specific debates in theology. How to make ideas part of the currency of the church? Do you have any ideas?
Sorry, I mean like ideas outside of just like arguing about theology?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting that oftentimes church leaders come from a very academic, kind of philosophical, theological background, and again, that kind of like teaching is very important to make sure that the church is morally kind of on the right grounds. But I would also love to see, some parts of church leadership come from people with different kinds of backgrounds. Like, what would it look like to include engineers on the parish council and make sure that their ideas about improvement and tinkering are a core part of what the church is considering as its mission?
Can you give an example of a technology that is very path dependent on whether a democracy develops it or not? How about the opposite, where it's not path dependent?
Yeah, so this is like a tricky thing, and innovation scholars talk a lot about to what extent is path dependency strong or weak, and there'd be particular moments in time where it's much stronger, and then you can create some new leapfrog technology that allows you to kind of reset. But to give one example, that we're developing today, I think artificial intelligence has a lot of path dependency in how we're developing it, how we're building it, what sorts of data are in their training data sets, what are the restrictions and kind of guardrails that we're putting on it. And again, I would be much more concerned about, say, how the Chinese Communist Party might use it to surveil their own people relative to, not that I love everything that's happening in the US AI industry, but I think it would be even better if the church was a major part of the AI development movement, and then we could put even better, I think, guardrails in a sense of kind of what is the right orientation for this technology in the human life.
It seems like an easy step could be to take a Christian university and make it one of the top research universities in the world. What do you think about that?
Love it. I think that'd be a great place to start. Actually, one idea that I've heard a friend bat around is that oftentimes when people are trying to launch new universities or revive universities, they oftentimes, I think, make the mistake of trying to be well-rounded. And they sort of say, like, oh, we're going to invest a lot of resources in a wide gamut of things, and we're going to try to be the next Harvard or the next MIT. And I don't know that you can compete by trying to recreate the same model. I think a different model that would be interesting is to try to be really spiky, choose like one particular area or subfield where you think you could really excel, offer the most promising, talented academic in that space the opportunity to build their own department from scratch, which is not going to be a opportunity they would get at a larger school, and then really try to build a world-class department around that particular area. I think that seems like an underrated strategy for trying to create a field of excellence within a particular area.
You mentioned the church should create a theologically grounded understanding of what it means to be human in the age of AI. Could you unpack that a bit?
When something that's flagging this is like, I don't know what it is. I hope other people here can figure it out. I'm just left. I feel like there's a lot of ways in which Christianity has, some versions of Christianity have made like load-bearing assumptions on what we think is uniquely human that could turn out to not be uniquely human. I think if you were to ask someone from 10 years ago about what are the first kinds of fields you would expect to be automated, I don't think anyone would say like illustrators, music producers, columnists, and yet that seems to be the kinds of skills that AI models today are very good at. And so I mention this mostly as a field that I'm genuinely interested in and have a lot of questions about, and not one that I feel like I have really strong answers to.
What tangible things can Christians in this room do in the near future to help the church be more ambitious?
I think one is just having conversations about this. Again, I think like it's hard to imagine the church taking real action unless they begin asking themselves the questions. Like again, why wasn't the church on the foreground of malaria eradication? That'd be like an interesting conversation, just like have more frequently. I think, as I mentioned, it would be useful to have like a tangible institution that is focused on cross-denominational R&D investments, and once that institution developed, you could imagine sort of like advocating within your local church to take some percentage of your donations and put it towards that kind of institution. I think at the denominational level, it would be really useful for us to have kind of like, what are the specific technological targets that the Southern Baptist Convention and the Catholic Church would both be excited about investing in? But you need to have those conversations in the first place before you can start the investments.
One person asks or says, in my church, it's been hard to get folks to unite behind causes that are less directly Christian. like city zoning petitions. Do you have advice for this?
Yeah, I do think one is, like, as I mentioned, there's sort of like theological underpinnings to really caring deeply about the world. And so the first would be like maybe having conversations about to what extent do the institutions and the work that we do on this earth matter? To what extent can they echo throughout eternity? I think making sure you have that theologically grounded understanding is going to make it much easier to then advocate for things like a really heavy focus on zoning ordinances or whatever. And I think the other thing is, and this is one of the reasons why I like this kind of larger community, is that the focus on actually being effective and on really getting results for your actions rather than just having good intentions is another, I think, common failing or failure mode that the church falls into. And so having conversations about like why we should care about effectiveness, why we should care about institution building, why we should consider the purview of the church as being larger than just kind of a simple evangelism are good places to start.
Sounds very good to me. So one person asked, of all the large-scale projects you suggested, is there one that you think has the best chance of resonating with the church and attracting broad support?
I think there is something uniquely attractive about sort of international development targets. I think I started with that malaria thought experiment because it is just so obviously a huge evil and injustice in the world that, you know, millions of people around the world are dying from things like malaria. And so that would be one place to start. I think at least on the, you know, church political level, I could imagine rallying a lot of attention and support around like what would a big push on this look like. Of course, the downside is that they are also like bigger targets from a financial perspective, and so it would be, I think, harder to maybe generate those kinds of returns. So I guess maybe on the other side of the spectrum, something that would be quite small and that individual churches could do would be, yeah, things like getting active in your zoning boards and kind of pushing for Yes in God's backyard to build dense housing around churches.
I'm noticing a lot more questions about church and church denominations, so I'm going to field a few.
Yeah.
One person asked, is there any specific church that is trying at their level of reach? Sometimes it takes one to show the rest how it's done.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure. I mean, so I'll say I go to an Anglican church, and one thing I like about Anglicanism is when I try to think, if I try to put on my strategic thinking cap, I could imagine Anglicanism being like a useful rallying point for some conversations around church unity. I think it's hard to imagine, say, the Baptists and the Catholics just directly going into bed with each other on something, but maybe you could sort of like organize something through the Anglican church as kind of like a very wide river that seems very pluralistic, but is still, I think, respected by folks on both sides. So that would be my particular point in favor of Anglicanism.
What would you say to those who argue these issues are not within the remit of the church? For instance, Christians who see their role exclusively as sharing the gospel.
I think I would probably just try to have a deeper conversation about like what does Jesus actually call us to do. I think N.T. Wright makes a lot of good points in that book, Surprised by Hope, about sort of the way in which the gospel has been misinterpreted across the centuries and kind of what led to the narrow focus on just pure soul saving rather than sort of building the kingdom of God on earth. So I think you would have to start with kind of some of those, what does the gospel actually say? And I think there's a very strong case that it makes this much broader, more ambitious set of arguments.
If capital, financial, social, intellectual capital weren't a constraint, what would you do in the next 12 months to advance the ambition of the church?
Good question. So I guess I would say like, one reason we focus on the particular issues that we work on at IFP is because we think things like better R&D, better pandemic prevention, more grounded understanding of kind of AI developments are all things that matter both for the world and to the church. And so when I'm working at IFP, it's not like an explicitly Christian institution, and we are working on things that we think are broadly, you know, pluralistic and positive. But I would love to see more Christians, I think, engage in those conversations. And I do think right now what we're missing is sort of an explicitly Christian institution to be able to have these conversations around. And so, you know, if I could clone myself for 12 months and kind of go do a second project, I think I would love to do something like creating this cross-denominational like R&D investments social impact fund.
What do you think of 7 mountains? Which the church should be best in fields of science, tech, religion, business, entertainment, family, and politics?
So I'm not familiar with 7 mountains. What is it?
I'm not either. But I assume that it was my ignorance. Maybe we'll punt that question.
Come find me afterwards. I'm happy to understand it.
Keep them coming. These are great. These are great. Mm-hmm. Do you think the fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant is a useful clarifying tool to explain why Christian ambition should be global in scale?
Totally. I think the fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant, I think there's a lot of stuff in the New Testament, both that Jesus explicitly says, he says, start basically in your local towns in Jerusalem, but then ultimately the goal is to go to the ends of the earth. And I think that implies a very explicitly kind of global mission and reach, and the fact that Paul spends so much time talking about the fulfillment of kind of the covenant to the Hebrews, and then the fact that we can all be adopted into God's family is going to the rest of the Gentiles is, I think, a key part of why the church should have very global, large ambition.
Do you think that the church might be hesitant to speak on some of the issues you mentioned because they're seen as political?
Potentially. I mean, so this is, I like the important tractability and neglectedness framework, partially because it can help you prioritize across these things. And so there may be areas of technology where it's important to have the church, eventually develop that would be inherently political, but I think there's a lot of areas that are not. Again, I don't know that there is a explicitly right-wing or left-wing position on which are the most important vaccine breakthroughs that we should make to improve the rest of the developing world. I think that is something that you can get sort of buy-in. To give one example, PEPFAR, which was sort of this big George W. Bush program that made really important progress against AIDS across the developing world, that has been introduced and sort of reauthorized multiple times by bipartisan Congress. And so I don't know that a lot of these technological targets have to be inherently political. Not to say that there obviously are some that are, but maybe we could start at the ones that seem to raise fewer hackles.
How can the church make itself more appealing to those working on those causes already? For instance, high levels of atheism in Silicon Valley.
I think the first is just being willing to engage deeply in the topics. Again, I think right now it's mostly the church is shut out, not because they have bad opinions, but because they're just not in the conversations at all. And so showing up, building the things yourselves directly, again, if Christians had a view of technology that went beyond family planning around cell phone, I think we could have real conversations, but that is the current level that we're operating.
What kind of pushbacks do you get when you give this talk to other church, parachurch organizations? I'm not sure if you have. Probably you've shared messages like this. Maybe share the top 2 or 3 pushbacks you get?
So this is actually the first time I've kind of pulled this together in this exact form. So you guys are the guinea pigs. So let me know what kind of pushback I should expect, I guess.
Any low-hanging fruit, a quick hit, home run, or an area close to solving a problem, especially one any church would actually be impressed enough to act? I know you mentioned malaria nets, but any other things come to mind?
Yeah, I mean, so going back to this chart, I think it would be great if, say, once this Christian institution develops, I think it would be great to talk to Jacob or talk to other folks that are kind of on the cutting edge of understanding, which of these technologies are we the closest to, which ones are other kind of scientists or philanthropic orgs already working on, is there a particular sort of niche that doesn't seem to be getting as much attention that the church could step up in? I think there's just sort of a sense that I like one phrase I've heard a lot is that when you're trying to start something new, you should be looking for quick, iconic wins. And so I think it would be important as almost like a proof of concept for whatever R&D institution this is, to try to find something that within the first 5 to 10 years we think we can actually make a meaningful difference on, proof of concept, and actually make and show real meaningful progress that could then sort of you could use to bootstrap and attack a larger remit of problems.
What would you say to some people who argue that the church, or at least some denominations, are inherently conservative?
I guess, yeah, I don't know if that is true. I feel like one nice thing about the Christian church is that there is such a broad remit of beliefs and views even across denominations. Obviously, some denominations have a lean in one way or the other. I guess what is exciting is that if we go back to this progress agenda, there are some things that I think would be naturally more exciting to some denominations than to others. I mean, this idea of rewilding bison on the American plains is mainly an idea I've heard from a lot of American conservatives, and so if they want to throw their weight behind that particular idea, that would be great. If they want to focus on some other area, I think that's fine. The nice thing about a progress agenda is that there are so many different areas of progress. There is so much low-hanging fruit. There's actually fruit on the ground that we can just pick.
All right, we only have time for about 1 or 2 more questions. One question is that, if you could go back to the slide you were just on, a lot of these seem or feel economically challenging to fund innovation on. Are you thinking direct funding or market-based approaches, e.g. advanced market commitments?
Yeah, I think this would be where once you would sort of like created some sort of organizational infrastructure, you could then do an analysis and sort of figure out like how financially intensive are each of these. I think at the very least, like you could imagine pulling together a couple of hundreds of thousands of dollars that could at least fund like a scientific grant or two to sort of like continue the work of existing labs. At a more ambitious level, you could imagine, funding advanced market commitments, or every little bit of demand helps. I mean, one of the things that economists will tell you about vaccine markets is that they are just so obviously broken, the kind of level of profit that you can make from the field relative to the amount of social value you can generate. There's like a huge, huge delta there. And that's why a lot of things like advanced market commitments make a lot of sense, which I guess for folks that aren't familiar, the idea of an advanced market commitment is that you would sort of premise large amounts of demand. Like we will promise to buy 100,000 or 1 million or 10 million doses if you can achieve goal X. And basically that promise of future demand reduces the risk on the manufacturer-producer side. This is what we did as part of Operation Warp Speed to kind of say, hey, we understand making a COVID-19 vaccine that may not work out for you or your investors is like an inherently risky proposition. So we promise if you can achieve X level of efficiency, we will buy hundreds of millions, if not billions of doses. And so every little bit of demand helps there. And again, I think just like making sure the church is starting to be in these conversations in the first place is a starting point. And the nice thing is that I think there are a lot of other philanthropies that are already working on these kinds of issues, and so we could at the very least like join in and make sure that the church is like part of a larger philanthropic coalition that's trying to make progress on these issues.
And one more question from me. Is there anything that we in this community can do to encourage you, support you, or pray for you?
I guess, I feel like this is my first time giving a version of this talk, so I would love to hear really honest and open feedback, or if people want to, take this message to their own congregations, I'm happy to share slides, or, I think this is like such a early conversation, and so I would love to just get feedback, and then I guess, prayer. My wife and I are having our first kid in 3 weeks, so I'm very excited about that, so if folks want to give prayer for us, that would be great for our family.
Amazing. Yeah. 2 round applause for prayer.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. I'd love to say a quick prayer for Caleb right now, and let's pray together. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for the work that Caleb is doing. Thank you that you've blessed this incredible passion on his heart to advance tech in a way that would lift up the downtrodden and really bring the world forward. I thank you for his conviction and also his coming here today. I pray especially for Kat that you would give her just a safe, wonderful delivery for their beautiful baby to come. And I pray this all in the name of Jesus. Amen. Next session will start in, I think, like 15 minutes or so. It's on the